Thanks, everyone. I know we hoped for better weather for today, and I hope, though today is, as worth pointing out, today is it's an international holiday, one of the few holidays that isn't attached to either states or nations or religion. It's a secular international holiday, so hopefully the weather is better someplace else while we're being rained on here. So I want to talk briefly about the history of MayDay, what it meant when it was created, and what it means for us now. And one of the first things that always comes up when you talk about the history of MayDay, which a lot of people don't know, is that its history actually begins here in the U.S. MayDay has its origins in the late 19th century in the struggle for the 8-hour working day. And the slogan of this is one of the main things I want to talk about for the 8-hour working day was 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours for what we will, dividing the 24 hours of the day into 3 sections. One would be the 8-hour working day, another would be, the 8 hours of sleep we're told that we should get, and a third would be 8 hours, or as the slogan goes, what we will, or a free expression of whatever one wanted to do with one's time. This struggle over the working day culminated in the famous events of the Haymarket Square in Chicago in 1886, in which, after a day-long rally, which is often remarked was fairly peaceful. There was and the mayor himself showed up at the rally and told his chief of police to let them continue to speak. At the end of the day, somehow a stick of dynamite or dynamite was exploded. People were killed. Shots were fired. And it turned out that some police officers were killed, some people in the audience were killed, although mainly the police were shot by their own friendly fire, it turned out. There was a very quick move to persecute the people, and it was primarily anarchists that were sought. In fact, they were sought with very little evidence. In fact, there's a famous quote from the judge saying to these defendants, "It's not because of what you did you're in trial, it's because you're anarchists on trial." And they were hung, although later their convictions were overturned, though they were already hung. So I want to say a few, that's my very brief history of MayDay. After that, there was an attempt to mark May 1st as this international day, International Working Men's Day. And for a long time, May 1st was an international holiday, although in the U.S. we tended to not observe it. We pushed our holiday to Labor Day to early September. And in fact, today is actually, in 1958, today was proclaimed to be Law Day USA, or National Loyalty Day. So there's been an attempt to create holidays, alternative holidays, which sort of separated the U.S., even though the U.S. was the site of the origins of MayDay, from this international holiday. And of course, all this is caught up with Cold War politics. So I just want to say a few brief things about some of the lessons from MayDay, and then hopefully we'll open up for some sort of discussion and what MayDay means for the struggle over education today. So go back to this slogan, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours for what we will. I think there's a very interesting understanding of freedom in that slogan. That freedom is not just about having the legal right to do something, that freedom is also, and most importantly, about having the time and energy to actually do something. The carving out of 8 hours of a day for what we will. That freedom needed, as a precondition, it needed time free from work, time free from exhaustion to exist. The other thing that's important about the original MayDay is that many of the people involved in the initial struggle, the labor struggle, they couldn't vote. They were new immigrants to this country. They had no political position. So they needed something like the struggle over the working day to take place outside of the existing political parties and existing struggle. So two lessons are: one, freedom seen is not just an issue of laws and rights, but also an issue of time and work. Second thing is this sense that in order to realize that freedom, one needs to move outside of the existing structures. And one remembers in our recent history, the last time that MayDay was a big thing in this country was in 2006, when it was marked by many of the undocumented workers in the U.S. as an attempt to point out how crucial their labor is and was to this economy in the face of massive criminalization and crackdown on undocumented laborers in the U.S. So they're picking up this theme of MayDay as a political protest for those people who are marginalized and excluded from both economic life and political participation. The other important lesson, I think, to draw from MayDay is the role that the police repression played, how quickly and how sloppily the trial was persecuted against the Haymarket martyrs, and how quickly the charge of violence was brought against those who had no real role in this violence. I don't know if you're paying attention to the news today, but this continues in the sense that one of the big stories that emerged even before this MayDay began were stories of police showing up in New York City, in one case pursuing a 6-month-old open container violation. Some person who was involved organizing MayDay events apparently had a 6-month-old drinking beer in public violation, and the police showed up at his apartment at the crack of dawn this morning and mainly wanted to know what he had planned for the day, using this warrant as an excuse, preamble. So the second lesson is that any time people begin to point to this role of inequality, or the role of work and its restriction of individual freedoms, the charge of violence will often come up, as we've seen again and again. So where do we stand now with respect to MayDay, this history, this once glorious, once forgotten holiday in this country? I mean, the first thing that struck me when I was thinking about this, and I was talking about this with people, and talking about the slogan, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, and 8 hours for what we will, that 8 hours for what we will still seems pretty utopian. I mean, we do have, in some sense, the 40-hour work week for some, but that 40-hour work week has been gradually eroded through mandatory overtimes, through the permeation of work in all aspects of life, through the sort of digital outsourcing of email and cell phones that make it harder and harder to draw a line between those 8 hours of work and those 8 hours of what we will. And also that 8 hours of what we will, even when it's not spent in terms of work, has been turned into its own source of profit and exploitation. I mean, when they were thinking about this back in the 116 years ago, they weren't necessarily thinking about those 8 hours being spent commuting to work, 8 hours spent consuming television and advertisements. They were thinking of 8 hours of freedom. So it's been eroded not just on the side of work, but on the side of consumption. But what does all this have to do with education? I mean, first of all, we have to acknowledge that to some extent, it's not all bad news, great strides have been made with education. In the 116 or so years that separate us from the original MayDay protests, education, university education, has in some way ceased to be sort of the purview of the rich, of the sons, mostly first sons, and later daughters of the wealthy, the only people who go to a university, and has been extended and reached a sort of apex, in the late 20th century, in which higher education, the creation of universities like this university, and higher education became a reality for so many people from the working class. But that apex has in some sense declined significantly since then. With rising tuition costs, there is an attempt to turn education back into something only for the elite. And I think it's important to think about that. I think that one definition of progress that I would throw out there is when something that used to be something only for the elite becomes something extended across society. And that is what happened with education. I think about this a lot because I teach philosophy, and one of the things I think about again and again and again when I teach philosophy, when I'm reading someone like, or talking about someone like Plato or Descartes or Hegel or whatever, how by and large when these people wrote and when these people produced their philosophy, they were primarily writing to only the free property-owning adult males of their society. And now that these texts can be studied by people who aren't necessarily males or property-holding or white, that is progress. But that progress to some extent is being rolled back with this increasing tuition and increasing debt. One of the things that concerns me a great deal about debt is not just its financial implications. They are massive. I mean, we met the $1 trillion mark of student debt on April 25th, it is estimated. And that debt becomes harder and harder to pay off and stands as a barrier towards other things that we've taken for granted as normal things in middle-class life. There was just an article in the paper this morning about how student debt stands in a way of people being able to own their first home, which has long been part of the sort of American dream, but also the way in which debt functions to reduce that 8 hours of what we will. It forces people to work more, to spend more of their time either working or searching for a job, and that erosion of the 8 hours of what we will. But it also turns one's ability to freely decide over one's life into something that's more and more a source of anxiety for the individual concerned and a source of profit for banks and other industries. So it seems to me that in thinking about MayDay and its sudden return, I used to be that I would always mark MayDay personally. Usually I would wear a red carnation on this day. I didn't wear one today because I figured there was enough of a mass movement that I could come and join that. Usually I'd mark MayDay by myself by attaching a little red carnation and having to explain it to everyone who asked me why I was wearing a red carnation, what this holiday was, why I was marking it, and what it used to mean. But I think in the return to MayDay, in the revival of MayDay, it's happening now in the face of Occupy Wall Street, I think it's important to think about how maybe the numbers might have changed. Personally, I think we could hold out the possibility of an even shorter working week if one wanted to be utopian. But how the basic fundamental idea of 8 hours, even 8 hours for what we will, of a life free from debt, from the restriction of one's choices, by the anxiety over one's job, the anxiety over one's health, the anxiety over one's standing in society, that we still really want what the original MayDay protesters wanted. We want freedom in our lives and a freedom from work, from exploitation, freedom from the constant transformation of every aspect of life into a source of profit. That's what I wanted to say.